There was a particular silence in those eastern mountains, a silence that seemed to guard rather than conceal, as if the hills knew things that had never been written down. Before continuing, the narrator leaves only a subtle note to the viewer. If you want, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and what time it is there now. After that, everything returns to the sober and intact mood of the narrative, as if nothing had been interrupted. What the archives now call the Briar Valley Girls' Institute Oath began to appear in local newspapers in the winter of 1884, when the county was still little more than a collection of scattered farms, a light-colored wooden church in the center of the valley, and the old stone building that housed the boarding school. A historian looking back might easily assume that the region was peaceful, isolated, and free of major tragedies, but that would be a mistake. The following decades would show that this collective disappearance would become a permanent scar on the records of the time. The Briar Valley Girls' Institute was a respected school, founded in 1869 by a teacher who had recently arrived from the coast. She believed that young women needed a solid education to thrive in a changing America. The school was a 2-hour walk from the main community, atop a wooded hill that sloped down to a narrow stream. It was a simple building, thick stone walls, tall windows, cold corridors, and a large grounds, always covered in mist on damp mornings. The weather in the region, especially in late fall, tended to change quickly. Opaque skies at dawn, a thin wind cutting across the fields, and a silence broken only by the boarding school bell calling students to class. The silent protagonist of this case is not a person, but the institution itself. Still, among the names preserved in the documents, one repeats itself more frequently. Eleanor Whitford, 15 years old, a diligent student, daughter of farmers who lived 3 kilometers from the valley. She appears in later testimonies as responsible for recording moments of daily life in small notebooks that were found years later, already damp and partially illegible. It is through these fragmented pages, added to the letters sent by the students themselves to their families, that most historians attempt to reconstruct the atmosphere that preceded the disappearance. According to records from 1884, 21 students were at the boarding school at the end of November. The number is consistent in reports, letters, and testimonies, except in one specific document, an inventory sheet dated December 3rd, which mentions 22. This discrepancy is considered to this day the first sign that something was not aligned in the archives. It is not known whether it was a counting error, a subsequent alteration, or another cause. But in light of the events that would follow, this small documentary deviation would be interpreted with extreme caution. The daily lives of the students, as recorded in the county's preserved records, included studies in literature, sewing, arithmetic, and morning exercises in the courtyard, a space of solid ground surrounded by trees that were slowly losing their leaves at that time of year. The most recurring description in the reports is of a disciplined environment, but with no evidence of violence, severe punishment, or serious conflicts. There were few teachers, usually residents of the valley itself, who lived there because there were no other stable jobs nearby. The region, however, was marked by an isolation that is difficult to translate into modern standards. Access to the boarding school depended on irregular trails, and any storm was enough to block the passages. As a result, letters took weeks to reach their families, and often the news that returned was only small fragments of student life. Even so, everything seemed to follow its usual routine until the last collective record, made in the institution's attendance book on the morning of November 28, 1884. It is at this point that mystery begins to creep into the archives. In the attendance book, the director's handwriting is firm as she writes down each of the 21 students' names. However, below the last line, almost as a spontaneous gesture, there is a note that should not be there. Meeting at the end of the afternoon. Lower room. There is no indication of the reason for the meeting. There is no signature. There is no date. And, more importantly, the lower room does not appear in any of the official building plans, nor in the subsequent maps drawn up by the search team. From this silent, cold detail, out of place in conventional records, the story begins to develop the shadow of something that is not supernatural, but that certainly does not fit easily into the administrative logic of a rural boarding school. This is the starting point for understanding how, in less than 48 hours, none of the 21 students would ever be seen again, and how each fragment of this case still holds questions that have remained unanswered ever since. And at the end of this first block, all that remains is the silence recorded in the documents, the enigmatic note, the room that should not exist, and the feeling that the routine of the boarding school would never be the same after that day. The routine at Briar Valley Girls' Institute, at least until the end of November 1884, was described in the documents as predictable, almost unchanging. For many historians, this predictability is precisely what makes the case even more baffling. Nothing in the previous records suggests serious tensions, internal disputes, or any abrupt movements. On the contrary, the boarding school seemed to follow the same rhythm it had maintained for almost 15 years. Mornings began before dawn. The metal bell echoed through the valley, rolling across the hills like a call that mingled with the distant singing of birds, the crackling of branches in the cold, and the sound of the careful footsteps of students emerging from their dormitories. Roof tiles creaked as the wind pressed against the wood, and a faint smell of burning coal permeated the corridors, coming from the furnace lit in the early minutes of the day. It was like this almost every morning, according to letters sent by the students to their families. Eleanor Whitford recorded in one of her notebooks that there was a kind of beauty in the organized noise of the boarding school, describing in detail how the young women walked in single file to the courtyard. The older ones went first, the younger ones behind, and they all wore light-colored aprons that contrasted with the gray of the mountain mist. Classes began at 7 o'clock with reading and text interpretation. The headmistress, Mrs. Mildred Hensbury, was repeatedly mentioned as a strict but fair woman, distant but not feared. The students described her as a figure of stone, always with impeccable posture, hands clasped in front of her body, and eyes attentive to the slightest deviation in behavior. During class breaks, some girls would go to the side garden, where herbs grew that were used both for seasoning and for simple medicines: chamomile, mint, yarrow. Others preferred to stay in the hallways, leaning against the cold stone walls, talking about their families, their fears, and their expectations for adulthood. All of them, however, shared something in common: a feeling of isolation. Being at boarding school meant living apart from the world, at least for months at a time. Letters were their only contact with the outside world, and they often arrived late or not at all. Some signs of strangeness began to emerge weeks before the disappearance, although they were only noticed in retrospect. In particular, a detail preserved in Eleanor's notes gained relevance decades later. She describes that, around mid-November, the headmistress began to insist on meetings among the most diligent, held at dusk in less frequented areas of the building. Eleanor herself was not invited, but she heard vague comments from colleagues about important discussions and additional training, although no one explained exactly the reason or content of these activities. Another point mentioned in family letters, but so discreetly that it almost went unnoticed, was the gradual change in the behavior of some students. 3 of them, specifically, were described as quiet, introspective, and began to avoid conversations that were once common. One of them, Margaret Doyle, left an enigmatic phrase in her last known letter: "There are things here that I need to observe before I understand." There was no context, no explanation, just that single sentence, which only gained weight when the searches began. Tax documents and county reports indicate that at that time, the boarding school was quietly suffering from a lack of resources. Maintenance of the building was minimal. Leaks were recurrent, and tree branches often hit the windows at night, creating sounds that the students described as footsteps in the hallway. Most of these descriptions, however, are interpreted as natural projections of young people living in an isolated place. Nothing suggests a real threat, just imagination, fatigue, sleepless nights, and the psychological weight of academic confinement. The relationship between the students seems to have been generally balanced. There are no significant reports of conflicts, aggression, or severe disputes. In some statements from family members, mentioned in county archives decades later, there are references to minor rivalries, typical of teenagers competing for recognition, attention from teachers, or leadership among groups, but nothing that would justify any profound disruption in the boarding school's routine. What really seems to divide researchers to this day is a series of small observations made by students in their correspondence. Comments about the principal being stricter than usual, vague notes about extra meetings, the use of areas of the building that did not appear on the initial maps, recurring mentions of an annoying noise coming from the floor below, which some described as wood being dragged. These reports, analyzed in isolation, sound trivial, but taken together, they suggest a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the dynamics of the boarding school, something that crept in slowly like a small crack in the disciplined daily routine. The last days before the disappearance, according to historical reconstructions, also coincide with a sharp drop in temperature. Night after night, the valley seemed to be swallowed by a thicker than usual fog. Lanterns had to be lit earlier, and the wind created long whistles between the cracks in the roof. One of the teachers, in a statement given many years later, said that there was something strange about the way the girls watched the sunset, as if they were waiting for something without knowing exactly what. And then we come to the afternoon of November 28th, the last confirmed afternoon that all the students were seen. The mysterious note about the lower room had already been recorded, although no one at the time knew what it meant. The cold was increasing, the wind was biting, and the shadows of the trees stretched like thin arms across the ground. Nothing in the official records indicates any visible disruption that afternoon. Classes ended at the usual time. The students gathered their materials. The principal walked down the central hallway as she always did. Everything followed the familiar flow. However, it is precisely this contrast, this intact normality, that makes the next block inevitable and disturbing. Because when the sun went down that night, no witness could say with certainty what happened inside the building in the hours that followed. And it is in this interval, between the last confirmed routine and the silence that stretched into the next morning, that the mystery of Briar Valley Institute truly begins. The historian, turning this page, realizes that the absence of clear explanations is, in itself, the most disturbing shadow of the archive. The county archives are unanimous in stating that the night of November 28, 1884, began like any other, but ended as a historic blackout. What happened between these 2 points, the normality of late afternoon and the absolute emptiness of dawn, is reconstructed only from fragments, interrupted letters, belated testimonies, noises mentioned in confessions, incomplete administrative records, and a succession of silences. The absence of direct witnesses did not prevent historians from tracing a probable sequence of events. The sun set quickly that night. A long wind swept across the courtyard and made the light from the lanterns flicker as if they were breathing. The students had dinner around 6, as noted in the cook's diary, a document preserved only because she, unlike the students, left the property every night to return to the small house where she lived with her sister. Her note for that night is simple: bad weather. They ate dinner in unusual silence. There is nothing else. But it is this unusual silence that many researchers interpret as an omen. Around 7 o'clock, according to later reports by teacher Agnes Riley, the only adult resident who was not at the boarding school at the critical moment, the headmistress had called 2 separate meetings that day, one with the teaching staff and another with a specific group of older students. Riley, who had to go to the village to buy medicine for her sick father, said she never knew the reason for the students' meeting. She only remembered that the headmistress had maintained an air of restrained severity in the previous days, more rigid than usual. The reconstruction of the last steps confirms that shortly after 7:30 a.m., 21 students were seen entering the corridor leading to the lower level of the building, the oldest area of the boarding school, built on a stone foundation dating back to the 1830s. The lower structure was known to be damp, narrow, and rarely used. It stored old items, discontinued teaching materials, and wooden furniture that was no longer used in the main rooms. From that point on, everything becomes fragmented. There are reports from neighbors, farmers who lived about a kilometer from the institution, who claim to have seen lights moving inside the building around 8 p.m. Lights that rose and fell, like lanterns being carried down narrow corridors. One neighbor mentioned hearing something she described as dry, serial knocks, but admitted it could have been the wind pushing loose objects against the outer walls. The wind that night was indeed strong. The gusts produced long whistles that crossed the valley, and dry branches scratched windows like restless hands. The only concrete internal clue comes from one of Eleanor Whitford's notebooks. Her last entry, although damaged by moisture, is perhaps the most studied piece of the entire case. In it, written in hurried handwriting, we read, "They called us all, downstairs. They say it's to decide something important. The older ones are different. I don't know what to expect, but it seems they already know. I mustn't write any more for now. There is no continuation. There is no new line. The next page is blank." To this day, researchers and experts debate whether Eleanor was prevented from continuing, whether she intended to write more later, or whether she simply closed her notebook to follow her classmates. What is most disturbing, however, is the explicit mention of the decision. No previous record from the boarding school uses this word to refer to school activities, meetings, punishments, or work. It was a word foreign to the institution's administrative vocabulary. The lanterns, according to hypotheses based on later testimonies, were extinguished around 9 o'clock. A farmer stated that the entire building was in darkness, something rare, as there was always some light in the upper windows to guide the teachers. This time, however, the boarding school was plunged into sudden darkness. The wind continued to blow steadily, sweeping leaves across the grounds, but no human sounds were recorded by those who lived nearby. One of the teachers, returning at 10 o'clock at night, reported that she found the main gate ajar, an unusual detail as the principal was known to lock it every night. Upon entering the grounds, she noticed that there was no movement, no light, no echo of footsteps. The silence seemed thick, almost heavy. She tried to call out to the students, but her voice was diluted by the wind. She walked to the main door, which was also unlocked, and entered the central hallway. It was there that she found the first concrete sign that something had happened. On the floor, near the staircase leading to the lower level, there was an overturned lantern, the flame extinguished, but still warm. The teacher recalls touching the metal and feeling residual heat, indicating that it had been used minutes before. As she walked up and down the hallways, she noticed that all the dorm rooms were empty, the beds made, some letters open on desks, and traces of folded blankets. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the absence of the students. The next step in the historical reconstruction focuses on the lower room. When the teacher finally went down there, she found only darkness and the strong smell of damp wood. The narrow hallway seemed even tighter that night, as if the walls were breathing cold. The flashlight she carried illuminated old boxes, accumulated furniture, and a door that was not on the maps. A dark wooden door, reinforced with iron strips, was partially open. This door would become the main focus of the investigation. Inside the small room, there were marks on the floor, circular scratches, as if something heavy had been dragged across it recently. But there were no large objects there, only fragments of wood, dust, and a feeling that the room had been used shortly before. No documents, materials, clothing, or tools were found that could indicate the purpose of that space. The teacher later stated that she felt a deep discomfort, as if she had arrived too late for something she couldn't understand. The most disturbing point, according to official investigation reports, was the impression that the students had intentionally moved to that area. There were no signs of struggle, escape, or resistance. On the contrary, the flashlights were turned off, the beds were made, and there were no personal belongings scattered about. Everything suggested an orderly, almost ceremonial departure. Subsequent investigators also noted that, despite the building being old and poorly insulated, no footprints were found outside. The ground was damp and soft due to recent rains, but there were no marks to indicate that 21 young women had crossed the grounds that night. This raised one of the central questions of the case. How could such a large group disappear without leaving any external trace? From that point on, the files enter a gray area. The teacher who found the boarding school empty was unable to locate anyone. The wind picked up around 11 p.m., making any attempt to continue searching in the darkness dangerous. She decided to return to the village to seek help, a difficult walk made against gusts of wind that obscured her vision and repeatedly extinguished the flame of her flashlight. This journey is the last confirmed part of the night. What happened between the moment she left the boarding school and the dawn of the next day remains one of the most unsettling gaps in the story. Because when the authorities finally arrived the next morning, something even more disturbing awaited them in the downstairs room. Something that would reinforce the impression that that night had been the culmination of something carefully prepared over weeks. And that is exactly where the next block begins, with the first official finding of the search, a finding that would forever change the way the county would remember the case. When the sun finally broke through the fog on the morning of November 29th, 1884, Briar Valley County authorities climbed the hill toward the boarding school with quick but cautious steps. The teacher who had found the empty building the night before arrived in the village, exhausted, almost voiceless, and her description, confused and slurred by the cold, was enough for the sheriff to mobilize a small team immediately. The wind had died down at dawn, and the valley was covered in a silence so uniform that it seemed to absorb every human breath. As they approached the building, the investigators realized that it remained as the teacher had described it. Unlocked doors, closed windows, unlit lanterns. There were no signs of intrusion, break-ins, or any visible damage. The structure seemed asleep, as if waiting for something or someone to wake it up. The first inspection focused on the main building. The dormitories were immaculate, almost artificial in their order. Beds were made, pillows were aligned, and some personal belongings were neatly arranged. A teacher who participated in the search stated years later that tidiness did not seem natural. It seemed intentional, as if they had left everything ready to be seen by someone. In the hallways, the files indicate that nothing was found other than the lamp knocked over on the staircase, still with a slight smell of burnt oil, and some small footprints, difficult to interpret due to the wear and tear on the floor. There were no clear tracks, no signs of haste. It was as if the students had moved in a restrained, silent, organized manner. It was only when investigators went down to the lower room that they found the first concrete trace and the most disturbing one. The room, which had been seen by the teacher the night before, remained almost unchanged. Dust had been stirred up, circular marks were on the floor, and fragments of wood were scattered about. But now there was something new, a row of 21 marks lined up on the stone wall, made with some sharp instrument, all at the same height, as if they had been carefully recorded. They were vertical lines, light but precise. 21 marks, not 22, not 20, but exactly 21, the exact number of students. The sheriff ordered the room to be recorded in detailed drawings, as cameras were rare and unavailable in the region. In his documents, he noted, "We don't know if these marks were left by the students or the administration. They are intentional, they are recent, but we don't know their meaning." This finding would become the center of all subsequent speculation. The principal, curiously, was not in the building and could not be found that day or the following days. Her disappearance further complicated the investigation. For some, she had fled. For others, she had been a victim of the same phenomenon that took the students. For a silent minority, she was the key to everything. The fact is that the absence of the head of the boarding school amplified the sense of confusion, and no official explanation was able to justify why she was not there when everything happened. Contradictory statements appear in the community's records. Some residents claimed to have seen the director walking down the road in the late afternoon of the 28th, wearing a dark coat and with a stern expression, alone, carrying no documents or luggage. Others claimed they had not seen her for days. There is no consensus. The only certainty is that she was not located in the initial searches. The teachers who lived at the boarding school showed no signs of involvement. This raised another key question. If something happened in that lower room, and all evidence points to this, how could such a large group have disappeared without any adult witnesses? In the following days, teams expanded their search to the surrounding area: trails, streams, dense forest areas, rocky terrain. Nothing. No clothing, no shoes, no personal items. The total absence of traces was so unusual that the case quickly became a topic of conversation in neighboring counties and then in regional newspapers. One hypothesis gained traction at the time: that the students had been led, voluntarily or not, through an internal passage that did not appear on the original maps. Later studies would show that the boarding school's foundation had been built on top of older structures, perhaps remnants of a previous shelter from 1832. But nothing at the site indicated a usable underground exit. Some collapsed tunnels were found decades later, but there was no clear connection to the lower room. The revealing element of this block, which humanized the tragedy and gave emotional dimension to the case, came from a set of incomplete letters found in the principal's office. There were 4 of them, all written by different students, and none had been sent. They all ended abruptly, as if they had been interrupted. The preserved fragments, although short, conveyed feelings that exposed the internal atmosphere of the boarding school in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. We are being called more often. Something will be decided soon. I wanted to write more, but I can't right now. I don't know if I should be worried, but the older ones are different. No explicit mention of fear, no direct accusations. Just hesitation, expectation, and this different that appears in 2 different letters, always associated with the older students. These letters shaped the most widely accepted hypothesis among recent scholars that the older students, perhaps influenced by the principal, were conducting some kind of internal activity, a pedagogical ritual, training, preparation that got out of control or took an unexpected turn. Not supernatural, but human. Pressure, influence, idealization, blind obedience, or the search for approval. None of this was unusual in isolated institutions of the time. The most bitter revelation, however, did not come from documents, but from the subsequent silence itself. For weeks, families climbed the hill repeatedly, bringing firewood, blankets, supplies, prayers, and hope. They scoured nearby valleys, fields, and forests with makeshift flashlights, calling out the girls' names, an echo that never found an answer. When the official search was called off, the boarding school was closed indefinitely. The row of marks on the wall remained untouched for almost 40 years, when the lower room was finally demolished during structural renovations. Today, only handwritten descriptions remain. Historians agree on one point. There was no mass escape, no kidnapping, no natural disaster. There was a deliberate internal movement, and that is precisely where the discomfort lies. The idea that something was decided, prepared, and executed within the school's own walls. There is no miraculous revelation, no perfect solution, but a cross-reading of the documents suggests a deeply human outcome. A group of young people, guided by misunderstood ideas, hierarchical influences, and emotional pressures, made a collective decision with irreversible consequences, a decision that, for lack of witnesses, could never be explained. And so the most painful part of the reconstruction is born. It was not the valley that swallowed those girls. It was the silence between them. It is at this point that the historian must step away from the facts and finally reflect, paving the way for the epilogue. Decades have passed since that cold morning in 1884, and even today the case of the Briar Valley Girls Institute remains one of the most eloquent absences from the archives of the American East, not only because of the scale of the disappearance, but because of the way silence imposed itself on it. Slow, deep, unbreakable. As a historian, when leafing through these yellowed pages and looking at the faded maps, the feeling is not one of investigative failure, but of a wound that has never found sufficient language to be explained. Over the years, new generations have attempted to reinterpret the documents. Some sought absolute rationality. They suggested impossible accidents, improbable escapes, cartographic errors that do not appear in later maps. Others preferred psychological hypotheses, group dynamics, emotional influence, decisions made collectively, marked by the rigidity of an isolated boarding school and the silent pressures that shaped the lives of young women at that time. And there were also those who chose simply not to interpret, just to accept that, in certain periods of history, what is lost are not only people but entire contexts, nuances, intentions, and meanings. Walking through the remains of the old boarding school, now overgrown with vegetation and partially rebuilt for other uses, it is impossible not to imagine what the sounds of that place were like in 1884. The wind blowing through the cracks in the building, the shy laughter in the courtyard during breaks, the bell calling students to class, and finally, the night when everything ceased, a night when the valley itself seemed to hold its breath. The marks found on the wall of the lower room, 21 aligned lines, each representing a student, became a symbol of an absence that the community never knew how to fill. For years they were seen as an involuntary memorial, resistant to oblivion. But when looking at the old transcripts, one realizes that the humanity of these marks is not in their content, but in their gesture. Someone, that night, took the time to record a collective presence, to affirm that they were there, before they were no longer there. The most tragic thing is to imagine that each of these young women had a story that, in a way, continued to exist only in the accounts of others. Parents who described them as dedicated, sensitive, curious, teachers who mentioned their talents, classmates who recalled small conversations, laughter on the stairways, fears shared during storms. None of these fragments, however, survived as a complete memory, only as scattered traces, lost in time, like leaves carried by the wind across the hills of Briar Valley. With the permanent closure of the boarding school, the valley slowly returned to everyday life. Children were born, farms grew, roads were opened, but among the older residents, the case was never forgotten. Not as a spectacle or superstition, nothing like that, but as a bitter reminder of how fragile the boundary between order and disorder, between routine and disruption can be. The absence of the headmistress, who was never found, became part of the silent legend that the county chose not to turn into myth. It simply accepted it as an incomplete piece. Today, looking at these documents, the researcher notices something that may have escaped many who investigated the case before. The records do not fail because they are scarce. They fail because they are human, because they were written by people who cried, feared, remembered wrong, or simply had no way of understanding what was happening around them. History is not a perfect map. It is a fabric of gaps stitched together with the hope that someday someone will fill them in. But some gaps are meant to remain empty. In the end, what remains is not the explanation, but the emotional trail. The wind blowing through the torn-out windows, the empty desks in the main hall, the staircase leading to the lower room, now just a cold, rebuilt structure without witnesses. And above all, the feeling that the 21 students never completely disappeared. They remain here, not in body, but in the question that refuses to die. What really happened that night? The possible answers fit within what humanity is capable of doing. Choices guided by fear, loyalty, pressure, or misunderstanding. Nothing more than that. The boarding school did not fall, the valley did not open up, the world did not change. Just a group of young people made a decision that could never be put into words. The role of the historian is not to solve a case like this. Rather, it is to recognize its depth, its pain, and its silence. It is to look at the archives and understand that some stories do not ask for a conclusion. They ask for respect. They ask to remain as old scars, reminding us that time keeps its own secrets and does not always allow them to return to the light. And so, as this account comes to a close, the researcher closes the last notebook with the same feeling that accompanies every page of this case, the realization that, in the heart of Briar Valley, it was not the disappearance that marked history, it was the silence that remained in its place. And it is in that silence that the narrative ends.